I think we need to tax our resources better. I think we need to tax wealth better. And in particular, the capital gains tax discount needs to be on the table. Not only will that raise billions and billions of dollars, mostly from high income earners, but also it will make housing more affordable.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and with a huge majority in the lower house and a Labor Greens majority in the Senate, the re-elected Albanese government has a unique opportunity to implement some big reforms.
Today, the Australian people have voted for Australian values. For fairness, aspiration and opportunity for all. Building an economy and a society that is every bit as strong and fair, as resilient and generous as Australians are themselves.
But also an obligation to future generations to deliver a better standard of living than we enjoy today. Now that's really why productivity matters. It's why budget sustainability matters. It's why resilience in the face of global turmoil matters as well. And it's why reform matters.
On the economy, it's chosen to put productivity front and centre. But what does productivity even mean? And how can the government make it better without throwing workers under the bus? And how else could the government take advantage of this big political opportunity to make the Australian economy fairer and leave a lasting legacy? Joining me today to talk about these questions is our senior economist, Matt Grudnoff. G'day, Matt.
G'day, Eb.
So, Matt, I want to start this whole conversation about the economy with the latest tax data, which regularly releases new information. But the most recent is from financial year 2022-23, so over a year ago. Yep. That's the most up to date. But it showed that there's 91 millionaires who paid no tax. Can you just start out by explaining to me, how does that happen?
Yeah, so we've got 91 people who earned more than $1 million in 1 year and they paid no tax at all. And that's because despite earning millions and millions of dollars, they had so many deductions that they reduced their taxable income basically down to zero or below the tax-free threshold. And then they didn't have to pay any tax at all. No income tax, no Medicare levy, no tax at all.
So as an economist, what's your assessment of that many people who earned over $1 million paying no tax? Is that efficient?
Well, I mean, there might be legitimate reasons. I suppose some of the more interesting part of this is that not only did they pay no tax, but they did pay a lot to someone in particular, and that was their accountants to manage their tax affairs, right? So the average Australian spends about just under $400 managing their tax affairs in a given year. The average person earning $1 million or more, and that's
so average.
Yeah, no, but not just the ones that paid no tax, but just people earning $1 million. So, they have more complicated tax affairs. They spend on average just under $6,000 a year managing their tax affair. This particular group that paid no tax spent about $130,000 on average managing their tax affairs. So, you need to hire some very clever people to manage to reduce your taxable income to zero and pay no tax.
Yeah, to think that's like you could hire an accountant for a whole year for that much money. So what does this data really reveal about how our income tax system is working?
Yeah, it tells a great story. And that story is that most of us earn most of our income from wages. In fact, over 80% of people's income comes from wages. But people who earn a lot of money, so going back to people earning more than $1 million a year, they earn it in a very different way. They only earn 25% of their income comes
from wages.
Only a quarter. Only a quarter of their income comes from wages.
Where does the rest come from?
Well, the majority of it, 60% of their incomes comes from capital gains. So capital gain is where you buy an asset for one price and you sell it for more. That's your capital gain. And you might ask, well, why do they want to earn so much income from capital gain? And it's because of the capital gains tax discount, where the tax office says, well, half of that's tax-free. So basically, it's a great way of reducing your taxable income. And the rest of it usually comes from dividends and investments and that kind of thing. But a huge chunk of it is around capital gains.
Yeah. So why do we tax income from wealth so differently from income from wages?
That is a great question. I think historically it's because the government has a lot of information on how our wages, most people are what we call pay as you go. So effectively, they don't even see that part of the income that's taken in tax. Your employer basically just takes it out. So it's really easy for the tax department and the government to tax in that way. And so I think that historically that's why it is. But also, rich people have a lot of political power and they have convinced governments that we should tax wealth more lightly. And
is there any economic reason that we would
absolutely
tax
none at all?
Okay.
No. This is all politics and no economics. No, look, I mean, we should be taxing wealth more. They have a great ability to pay more tax, and because of growing inequality, there are a larger and larger. Wealth is being more and more concentrated in a smaller group, and we should be extracting more tax from that in order to fund the kind of things that the government wants to supply to us, or we demand from our government.
Yeah. So we kind of set this up to talk about the opportunity that the Albanese government has with its big majority and a lot of political capital.
And that's why I've asked the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, to convene a roundtable to support and shape our government's growth and productivity agenda.
And the best way to think about the difference between our first term and the second term that we won last night, first term was primarily inflation without forgetting productivity. The second term will be primarily productivity without forgetting inflation.
Our plan for economic growth and productivity is about Australians earning more and keeping more of what they earn. We want to build an economy where growth, wages and productivity all rise together.
The government has flagged that it wants to focus on productivity in this term, and it's kicking that off with a bit of a roundtable. Is productivity the biggest issue for the Australian economy?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. Productivity has certainly slowed, and productivity is the amount of output you get from a given amount of input. So the more productivity you get, the more stuff you can get from working, and the more stuff we have. So that's why economists like it. But the problem is productivity is not an easy thing to measure for things like services. And Australians have increasingly been demanding services. So if you look at health services or education services, measuring productivity, well, you could get more educational output if you had bigger class sizes, right? If we doubled the amount of, class sizes, we could halve the number of teachers. And so therefore per teacher, we get more students through. But the problem is the quality of education is going to plunge, right? And that's where productivity has a problem. It struggles to measure quality. And so part of the reason we might have seen this drop in productivity is actually just because we're demanding more services of things that are hard to measure, and we're failing to measure productivity properly, or that simply we want things where there isn't strong productivity growth.
I mean, it always struck me that when it comes to productivity, I kind of only hear about it in one way, and that's what the business lobby thinks is productivity, which normally means lower wages. Why is the debate around productivity so narrow, generally speaking?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting about that is you're absolutely right. The Business Council usually wants to talk about flexibility, which means lower wages. But lower wages usually means slower productivity. In fact, higher wages can lead to higher productivity. Why? Because productivity effectively is how much output you can get out from an hour's work, right? And so if a business has to pay its workers more per hour, then it's going to look at trying to increase the amount of output it can get out. It's going to give them better capital equipment. It's going to give them better machines. It's going to try and organise them in a more efficient way in order to maximise the amount that it can get out. If it doesn't have to pay its workers very much at all, then it doesn't need to be particularly efficient with it. So ironically, if we increased wages, that would probably almost certainly lead to an increase in productivity. And if we allowed them to cut wages or, reduce real wages, that would probably lead to less productivity.
And does it follow that when you get more productivity, that workers kind of get a share of that through wage increases?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Now, no is the short answer. Businesses like to say, well, if productivity goes up, then we'll pass all of that on in higher wages, right? But there's no automatic, there's no automatic route by which that happens. In fact, it could end up as higher wages, or it could end up as bigger profits.
Yeah.
And recently what we've seen over the last, 10 or 20 years is that most of the productivity gains have gone is as higher profits. They haven't gone to wages because businesses have had more bargaining power in the current kind of industrial relations system.
Yeah.
And so they've been able to keep wages low and keep that productivity gains for themselves in the form of higher profits.
Seems like a bum deal.
It does if you're a worker.
That's right. So I wanted to turn next to the perennial question of the GST and I guess broader tax reform. So productivity is one thing, but this question of tax reforms is another that perennially comes up. And so I guess at the state and territory level, we've seen, it really seems like public services are being eroded. I think people notice it the most in public health, often looking at stories around waiting times and things like that.
Ambulance ramping.
Yeah. Is that kind of backed up by the data that public services are kind of waning, I guess?
Yeah. So the GST is a really important source of revenue for the states. It's actually collected by the federal government, but the federal government has all the powers, or most, not all, but most of the powers to raise all the big amounts of revenue. But the states have these huge responsibility for providing services like health and education, for example, two big spending areas. And so the federal government collects the revenue and gives some of it to the states. And the idea of the GST is they would give them all of the GST, and this would be the growth tax that the states could rely on in order to stop having to constantly beg the federal government for more money. We've got new research on the GST that shows that the GST hasn't been a growth tax at all. In fact, as a share of the economy, it hasn't kept up. And so one of the reasons we're seeing state and territories increasingly struggle to fund things like health is that GST revenue hasn't kept up with the growth in the population. It hasn't kept up with the growth in the cost of providing these services. And so state and territory governments are forced to constantly try and find ways of cutting spending or to go into deficit. And what we've seen is both, basically. And so what we actually need is either a change in the GST, or we need to be able to supplement that GST money with more money from other taxes.
Yeah, because is GST the only way that the Commonwealth government could help out the state?
No, when they set the GST up, they made a deal with the states that they would pass on all the revenue, but it doesn't just have to be the GST. They could come up with other kinds of taxes. We could have a tax on gas exports, and all of that revenue could go to the states to help them fund schools.
If we chose.
And hospitals, if we wanted to.
Yeah.
We could have wealth taxes. We could tax wealth better, and the money from that could go to the states in order for them to fund those services.
And the idea is that the Commonwealth collects the GST and then distributes it to the states. How does it do that? Is that mechanism, is it like each state gets what it raises? How does that work?
No, so there's a thing called the Commonwealth Grants Commission. It has a formula that works out how it splits the GST up. And once a year, they all get together and basically the feds, explain how it's being handed out. And then the states and territories argue that, it's not right, it's not being distributed in the right way. And they have a big bun fight. But basically, there's a formula that's managed by the Commonwealth Government's Grant Commission, and they hand out the GST by that formula. And it's not based on how much you raise, it's based on how much it costs for each state and territory to provide those services.
One issue that is not in dispute and never will be, and that is the GST deal for Western Australia. This is a deal that as Treasurer I sponsored, as Prime Minister I legislated. And the one person you can trust any more with this deal is the person who actually brought it about, and that's me.
Does the Commonwealth ever kind of make amendments to that? Is it all done on the formula? I'm just thinking now, didn't Scott Morrison do some kind of a deal a while back?
Scott Morrison didn't change the formula in that particular case. What happened was Western Australia was going through a massive mining boom. They were making enormous amounts of money. And so their share of GST revenue was going down. And they were complaining about that. Perhaps there might have been some marginal seats also in WA.
You don't say.
Yeah. And so Scott Morrison came along and basically gave them a top up. So it wasn't that he changed how the GST was distributed. He took money from other sources that the Commonwealth had collected and he gave them a massive top up. And the problem with this was a time when the WA economy was doing really well. They were raising lots of revenue.
Yeah.
And so effectively, more money was being funneled to Western Australia, but states who were actually struggling, were missing out.
Yeah. The other thing I want to ask about is in a similar way in debates where, the business lobby only ever talks about cutting the company tax rate. I feel like when it comes to the GST, commentators always just kind of talk about raising the rate.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other reforms that we could make to the GST so that it would bring in more revenue?
Yeah, so the GST is regressive tax, which means it hits the poor harder.
Why does it hit the poor harder?
So basically, if you spend 100% of your income because you're just meeting your basics, so imagine you're on a really low income and you have to spend all of it just to pay the rent, buy basic food, groceries, just the basics.
Heating and cooling, yeah.
And let's say the GST applies to all goods, then you're going to pay 10% of your income in GST because you spend all of it.
Yeah.
Now imagine you're quite wealthy and you only spend, say, 60% of your income and you save the other 40% because you're doing quite well and, it goes into investments and other things. Then you're only getting taxed on 60% of your income. So you're actually paying 6% of your income is GST.
Okay, I'm with you. And so, sorry, back to the point about other ways to reform the GST.
Yeah, so if we just simply increase it or broaden it, then it will usually hit the poor a lot harder. But there are actually items that are currently exempt from the GST, so we could broaden it and increase it, that aren't going to hit the poor. And that includes private school fees and private health insurance. And they're currently exempt from the GST, but they're also items that high income earners disproportionately buy. So if we were to extend the GST to those items, we would raise an extra $1.8 billion a year. And it would be progressive in that it would mostly target high income earners.
Yeah. So overall, Matt, is Australia a high taxing or a low taxing country?
We're a very low taxing country. Compared to other nations, we don't collect much tax at all. In fact, if we collected the average for developed countries, for OECD nations, we would be collecting an extra $140 billion per year. $140 billion per year. We're currently having this big debate about whether or not a deficit of about $20 billion is a problem. If we had another $140 billion, right, you wouldn't have a deficit to begin with, but you would also have, more than $100 billion to spend on all those kind of things that people are crying out for. We could put dental in Medicare. We could do all kinds of things to help improve the lives of Australians with the services that governments need to provide for them, that Australians are demanding. So the reason we can't do that is in part because we are a low tax country.
So I guess overall, if we talk about Australia being a low tax country, we're going to have a conversation about productivity, but hopefully that will also include tax reform. I guess, what do you think are the prospects for getting some genuine tax reforms in if, things like changing the GST become the only thing we talk about? Like, how broad does the conversation need to be to truly, I guess, make a difference in the amount of revenue that government collects and then the services that it helps to provide?
Yeah, well, I'm an eternal optimist. You have to be in this job. And I think that there is actually a strong appetite for change. I think that this idea that the solution to our economic problem is not just cutting government services. I think people have worked out that actually in some areas like health, like education, like infrastructure,
aged care,
there are a whole heap of areas where the government is the best one to provide those kind of services, and that there is a real demand from Australians for high quality services of this kind, and that they understand that, in order to do that, then we need to make a bigger slice of the economy needs to be devoted to the government, and the government can do that by increasing taxes. So I think that more and more there is a consensus that we do need to raise more revenue. Obviously, there are still people pushing back on that. But I think that the general public is on side with the idea of higher taxes. Now, you need to remember that when we talk about higher taxes, we don't necessarily mean higher taxes on low and middle income earners. They're already hit pretty hard.
Yeah.
What's different in Australia is that, there are a lot of tax concessions. Australia is great at handing out tax concessions, the vast majority of which flow to high income earners. We're really bad at taxing wealth, and we're really bad at taxing our resources, particularly
So there's
gas.
a lot of things that we could tax before it kind of impacts everyday Australians.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And so if you close those big tax loopholes that allow millionaires to pay no tax, if you tax our resources better, then you can raise that extra $140 billion, take us up to the average without impacting everyday Australians. But you will impact them because they will get better services.
I was going to say, and who uses those services? Primarily it would be low and middle income earners,
the
right?
majority of Australians.
Yeah.
Yep.
So overall, Matt, what are your hopes for tax reform? What ideally would you like to see be part of this debate?
I think we need to tax our resources better. I think we need to tax wealth better. And in particular, the capital gains tax discount needs to be on the table. Not only will that raise billions and billions of dollars, mostly from high income earners, but also it will make housing more affordable. I mean, I think one of the biggest issues that we currently have in Australia, as seen at the last election, is the housing crisis. And if we can reduce house prices, if we can make housing more affordable and raise billions of dollars from high income earners to better fund services, that is a win-win-win.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me today, Matt.
Thanks, Eb.
You can find all of our research on the Australian economy and tax reform on our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or via the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 7th of July, and some things may have changed since recording. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.